I'm so glad that I came across this interview with Theo Von and the Amish teenager. So just before that, I had tried to watch the Drake and Bobby Althoff interview, and it was not my cup of tea. And then after I recorded that short video, I did try to go back and watch it, and I was like, nope, not doing it. I need to find something else to watch. And then I saw the thumbnail for this interview, and within the first 2 minutes, I knew that I wanted to watch this interview. It was just so refreshing to hear from a teenager who is Amish and had a completely different cultural background and just kind of experiencing modern things for the first time. And there were a lot of great comments I saw echoing this, and I'm really glad that I gave this interview a chance, especially since it kind of connects to other videos that I've done where I've talked about the community of people who wanted to create a white-only town, and I was making the comparison to the Amish community and all of that stuff. And so it's really good to get an opportunity to hear firsthand from a teenager, from someone currently in the Amish community, what their way of life is like. And I think it's really refreshing to learn about the Amish community in this sense, because this is someone who you're hearing from who is not corrupted by modern society, and that's probably a very rare thing to find. This is Hey Brittany. Welcome back. So Theo Von interviewed a Amish teenager named Timothy, and he is obviously going through this period where he is allowed to be out in the modern world. He's kind of going through different experiences to help him determine if he wants to commit to the Amish community or if he wants to leave the Amish community and join the modern world. And what they call this time period is Rumspringer. And so this is basically when you're 16 and a half, you are still living within the Amish community, but you can basically come and go on the weekends so that you can have different experiences. And this helps you make that decision on whether or not you want to leave. And I actually think that this is a really smart thing and a cool thing that they do, because you would assume that for most communities where the culture is a little bit different or very different from what we think of as modern society, that they would not let you have any exposure to anything outside of the community, because that would kind of corrupt you, it would tempt you and all of this stuff. And so you can see that with really religious people where they are very strict, like, hey, just read the Bible, don't watch TV and all of that stuff. So I am glad that they have this period where they can kind of get out of the bubble in a sense and kind of have more experiences. But then also too, if you are someone who lives in the modern world and you're seeing this kind of wholesome and innocent community as far as how this teenager Timothy is telling or talking about his community, it makes you not want to be a part of modern society. So it's just interesting to kind of experience the world through someone else's eyes who doesn't have to deal with all of the craziness, the chaoticness, and all of the drama that we deal with in the modern world. So let's talk about some of Timothy's experiences. So he mentioned that he does have a smartphone, and he talked about him seeing a smartphone for the first time. And he did have a family member who was ex-Amish, so they chose to leave the Amish community. That guy had a girlfriend, and I guess the girlfriend and the ex-Amish person, they came back into the community to visit, and the girl pulled out her phone, and he was just talking about how she was typing really fast, and like words were just appearing on the screen, and he was just really fascinated by seeing what a smartphone can do, because in the Amish community, they do not use electricity the same way that we do, and so their lives are very different. And so I can imagine someone being very surprised at seeing a smartphone for the first time. I know that I was very surprised to see an iPhone for the first time, because back then my first phone was a flip phone, and then going to something like I think it was initially the iPod it might have been the iPod, because that was basically the music player without the phone. And then when the phone came out, it was just like a game changer, because it combined two things in one. And so I can't imagine experiencing a cell phone like the iPhone for the first time in 2025 and how that would make you feel. Like, do you feel like you're behind the time, or are you just so happy that you're being exposed to something new but you don't really think about it like that? And so that is a good experience that he shared with us, because a lot of us have been using cell phones or smartphones for a very long time, and there's some people who try to go back to using flip phones or dumb phones, and it is a huge change to go from having a smartphone back to using a flip phone. So it was just to keep this short, it was just really cool to hear him talk about being exposed to a smartphone for the first time. And interestingly, he also mentioned that the Amish community, if they have cell phones, they use Snapchat a lot, and I don't know why that is exactly. So Snapchat allows you to send pictures, videos, and text messages, but they also disappear. And so I don't know if it's like the privacy part of it, of everything being able to disappear. I don't know if that's the draw here and why people are using Snapchat. I personally do not use it. I've used it on and off over the years, but it's not something that I've ever been into or have wanted to use to communicate with my friends and all of that stuff. And so that was just cool to hear him talk about Snapchat. And then he's also gone to concerts. I think he mentioned going to Theo Von's concert. So I know him as a comedian. I didn't really know that he was also a musician, so I'm not sure if I'm reading that wrong. And then he also talked about driving a Corvette, and it was really funny because he made this analogy because he's comparing it to things that he experiences in the Amish community. And so he said that driving the Corvette was like riding a horse that had been given special oats because it was going really fast. And so that was just a really wholesome, innocent moment and a really great comparison because, again, if you are in the Amish community, you guys do things very differently. Like they have buggies or they have like a carriage that is drawn by horses and all that stuff, so they don't use cars. And then he was also talking about how they use scooters, like the old-fashioned ones that you kind of have to kick to push and all of that stuff, not the motorized one. And then I think at one point he was talking about scooters, but then he also might have been talking about a bike, and I don't know if that got mixed up, but it was just really cool to hear him talk about these things and being fascinated by them when we've had that stuff for like decades, and some of us like adults, we don't really care about that as much, but hearing a kid talk about that, it does make you remember your childhood and all the things that you experienced or learned about for the first time. And then also he mentioned wanting to jump out of a plane. So I think he said he hadn't been on a plane before. And so they were making the joke like, hey, you're going to get in a plane for the first time and then you're going to dip, you're going to jump out because he wants to go skydiving. And then he also talked about being in a helicopter. And I thought it was funny because he was talking about how I think the plane or the helicopter, it went sideways over the lake. And then I guess he was talking about, falling out. And he's like, oh, I had my trusty seatbelt on. And then he was talking about like, hey, if you fall, it's like hitting concrete and all of that stuff. And so they do have, I would assume that he would have been told that and so on, but it was just really cool to hear him talk about his different experiences that he's had during this period of time where he was able to explore the modern world in order to help him make his decision on whether or not he wants to stay in the Amish community. Moving on, I want to talk about what it was like observing and listening to the conversation because it was really weird in a good way because it was a combination of like a language barrier because he mentioned speaking English and Pennsylvania Dutch, which is basically kind of like a variation of German. And then he also talked about how he couldn't, I think he could read and write German, but he couldn't like understand it, I guess, to say it or something like that. It was really weird how he explained it, but I also understood what he meant by it because there's some people who can read and write in another language, but they can't speak it or they can't understand what they're writing. They can just write it. I don't know, really weird. But then also, in addition to some of like the language barrier, and I don't know if it's a language barrier as much as it is him not being familiar with everyday words that we use in the real world versus the words and the terms that they would use in the Amish community. And then we obviously have culture differences because the Amish community, again, they live their lives completely different than the way that we do in modern society. And all of this was compounded by just the innocent way that he spoke about all of his different experiences and what it was like growing up Amish, because clearly we're talking to a teenager, so he's communicating to us from that lens. And I saw a really good comment where it was basically saying that Theo Von does a really good job of kind of like, the comment said that he dumbs himself down, but he does a really good job of meeting his guest or the person that he's interviewing where they are and being able to connect with them. So I think that is a good trait for a host to have, because if you are constantly kind of like not on the same page or able to understand what your guest is saying, it just makes the conversation weird. And so I thought that he did a good job as a much older person compared to Timothy. Theo Von did a good job of kind of coming down and kind of talking about things the way a teenager would and kind of trying to understand what was being communicated, and then also continuing and moving the conversation forward. And the one thing that I found super funny is that Timothy kept talking about his coworker, and I'm like, dude, you're 16, you're 17, whatever, and you already have a coworker. Like, I know people in the modern world or regular society, they do work part-time jobs and all of that stuff, but he just seemed like he was so responsible and had so much responsibility for someone who is as young as he is. And it obviously tells you or speaks to how people in the Amish community are raised, because he was saying that they really help each other out. There's this sense of being a part of a community and contributing to it, whereas now in the regular society, we do contribute to our community, but it's in a very different way. Like, people don't just go out of their way all of the time to help each other. It's more so, well, somebody has to ask you, and they have to be in extreme circumstances and all of that stuff. And so you do have people who are genuinely nice in regular society, but I feel like that's also very rare to come across these days. And what I really liked about him talking about his coworker is because they talk about how in the Amish community they build things, and this made me think, just to connect it to other relevant topics, this made me think of how they were talking about all of the destruction in California in the Palisades with the fire that happened there a few months ago, and they were talking about like how I guess it's going to be like this huge effort to rebuild everything. And then I saw a post where they were saying like, hey, you know, this Amish community, they built 12 houses in 48 hours, so you can do something this quickly to help give people places to live and all of that stuff. And so they were basically criticizing Gavin Newsom because this project to rebuild the Palisades in California is going to take so long, but this is proof that it's actually not going to take as much money and as much time as you think it would to rebuild those communities. And obviously there is a difference because they're building tiny houses in this post that I'm showing, but the people in the Palisades in California, they would have lived in kind of like bigger houses and if not mansions and all of that stuff. And so that would be more time consuming, but the point is to show you do have a community of people who are great builders who can get things done in a very quick time frame. Okay, so education. So what I found surprising in this part of the conversation is he talked about how basically the first graders through the eighth graders are in one room. And I don't really know how that works. Like, are you in one room, but you're grouped off in your different age groups and all of that stuff? And then just, I don't know, I went to a K through 12 school, but obviously we were very separated. We weren't in one room, obviously. It was maybe a 5-building campus or something like that, maybe 5 to 10 building campus or something like that. And we had our separate spaces to learn what was appropriate for our age group and our grades and all of that stuff. But here he's talking about everybody being in one room. There's one teacher, so one teacher has to know enough to teach the kindergarteners or the first graders and the eighth graders, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I wonder if that hurts your education in any way, because you don't get all of the attention that you would if it was just for your individual grade. And then he also talked about how they don't go beyond the 8th grade. Now, this makes me think of the SoCast interview that I covered with Nick Fuentes, Adam Sosnick, and then that panel interview that he did. And there was one girl who's complaining about basically how she thought women should be able to get an education, they should be able to go to college and all of that stuff. And then here you have someone, and I think she was saying that her mother never made it past, her grandmother never made it past the 3rd grade or something like that. And then here you have this Amish kid saying, hey, you know, we don't go past the 8th grade. And obviously this is within a specific community, but I also at the same time, it shows you one that college is not maybe necessarily important, but it also highlights the disadvantage you are at if you only have a 8th grade education, because I can't imagine 8th graders in real or regular society going out into the world with only an 8th grade education. I think you should be able to do everything that you need to with at least a high school education, but an 8th grade education is crazy, and so you are really having to learn things about the world through experience at that point if you aren't getting the high school experience. And so that was pretty interesting to me, because I don't know if people would be like, hey, you know, yeah, it should really just be 8th grade in high school and all of that stuff. And so it was just, I guess in the world that they live in, they don't really, you do need to have like a higher education for some things that you do. And by higher education, I really mean high school, because in college you're just kind of going deeper into certain areas, certain disciplines and all of that stuff, right? And we can park aside doctors and all of that stuff and advanced degrees. We're just talking kind of like about the basics right now. And so in a lot of areas of life you can get away with just a high school education, but I can't imagine only having an 8th grade education. Like, I'm thinking back to what I knew in middle school and how I thought about the world and how different it is when I graduated high school and how I felt about the world then. And so that is pretty crazy to think about a bunch of teenagers who only have an 8th grade education. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think there are obviously bad elements of that, but it's also good because it shows you that one, education doesn't just come from the school system, it comes from real life experience in the world. And going back to the sense of community, they talked about how the community came together to pay hospital bills if someone needs to go to the hospital because they do not have insurance. And then they're also exempt from other things because of their religious beliefs, so they don't have to fight in wars and all of that stuff. And then they also don't have like home insurance because they were talking about how somebody's house burned down. And then Thea Vaughn made this reference to like, oh, was it the candle that caused the house fire and all of that stuff? But the bigger conversation was around the fact that we have people in regular society who will kill and murder people for their life insurance policy, and that's not something that they have in the Amish community. So obviously there should be less occurrences of that type of stuff happening, because if you watch Snap, you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. We have a lot of crazy people who are doing crazy stuff in the name of money. Now, speaking of money and how they talked about the community coming together to help pay off large bills, I don't know exactly how they make money, and this may not have been a question that Timothy would have been able to answer, being that he is as young as he is, but how do they even advertise their business? How do they form their businesses? Who are their clients and all of that stuff? And so I would be interested in learning more about how they generate money and sustain themselves, or are they just able to sustain themselves within their Amish community without having a business for profit? And so that's something that I'm interested in. Okay, moving on, they talked about the birds and the bees. And so in the Amish community, they do not have this conversation. So you are basically left to figure it out on your own. And I've been watching shows like Outlander and also, Bridgerton. And basically there's this whole idea that women, before they're married, they know very little about sex, and then they go into their marriages and kind of learn a lot more through experience, right? And so he was saying like, hey, we don't have this conversation, you have to figure it out. And then he was talking about how he has a phone, and so he can like look things up and figure it out. And there was this awkward moment where Theo's like, hey, you're not looking at porn, right? Like, okay, good, don't do that. And so there were a lot of awkward and funny moments like that throughout this interview, because obviously Timothy is talking about things from like a 16-year-old, 17-year-old perspective, and Theo Vaughn is talking about it from a much older perspective, and kind of reading between the lines and trying to figure out what exactly Timothy is saying, while also kind of being age appropriate in what he said. And so it's just super funny to watch him navigate that. It's almost like a parent talking to their child and having to have a awkward, uncomfortable conversation, but also in the best way, because this really was a entertaining interview. And I also thought it was really funny when Timothy was talking about cheerleaders and women in bathing suits and how they're underdressed and how they're like doing stuff in their underwear, because that's exactly what it is. Because a long time ago, or a while back at least, I learned that they came up with like the way that bathing suits came about or something like that. It was first created by a man, and basically at that time, women wore much different bathing suits, and so they were trying to convince women to wear these new style of bathing suits. And at first it was the prostitutes who were wearing those bathing suits, and then it caught on, and then everyone knows that bathing suits are basically just lingerie that you wear in public. They can be really skimpy and revealing and all of that stuff. And so it was really nice to hear someone say like, hey, you know, why are you doing this in your underwear? Like, can't you wear like more clothes? And then Theo was making the joke that people get even more half-dressed or completely undressed in situations where they should be more dressed. And so that was just obviously an awkward thing to navigate, but it is true that women do half-dress when they go out to certain places and when they're in certain environments. And speaking of just women being half dressed, that made me think of a post or something like that where I read where this girl was talking about how uncomfortable her father was in public because she was talking about people wearing like the booty shorts, like the bike shorts, and then really tight yoga pants and have big butts and all of that stuff. And she was basically talking about how her father was so uncomfortable that he basically just looked at the floor the whole time because he didn't know where to look. And I can imagine how uncomfortable that is as a man, because there's sometimes when I'm out in public, I'm like, oh gosh, I don't want to look at this person because everybody else is looking at them. They're intentionally drawing attention to themselves and all of that stuff. And so even I, as a woman, I get weirded out seeing like too much of a woman's body, because that's just weird, because you don't need to be dressed exactly in that way to go out in public. And I know fashion trends change over time and all of that stuff, but it is uncomfortable even as a woman to see women dressed a certain way. So I can't imagine how men are feeling, especially older men who are kind of like, you're like my daughter, this is gross, like put some clothes on and all of that stuff, like being disgusted by what they're seeing and just having to awkwardly navigate those situations the best that they can when women are half dressed everywhere. And then moving on, they also talked about the founders effect, which is basically because the Amish community, they are basically descended from 200 to 500 founders of the Amish community from Germany and Switzerland, and because they're all descended basically from the same group of people, there is a lot of overlap genetically and they're all like distantly related. And so they were talking about whether or not they have diseases in the Amish community, because we know that they don't get vaccinated, so they in general have a lot less medical conditions compared to regular society. However, because they are more genetically or closely related, they do have more cases of rare genetic disorders because of that. And this made me think about, there's a community in Virginia where there's basically a bunch of inbreeding, and the people there look very different from people who do not have those sort of incestuous relationships and all of that stuff. And so that's not something that you see a whole lot of in the Amish community, but you do see rare genetic diseases just because everyone is descended from the same people basically. And I really liked how he talked about having like this family tree, which is basically a book. He described it as a dictionary, but he's really talking about a phone book where you have people's information, their kids, their ages, their addresses, and all of that stuff, who they're related to. And so I thought it was really cool that they can trace their genealogy that way, because what they say for Black people, if you came from Africa and you lose sight of all of that history, the genealogy of your family and your lineage and all of that stuff. And so it's really cool that they have something that they can refer back to and see like, hey, this is where I came from, this is where they came from, and all of that stuff. So it is really cool that you can trace your family history in that way, just because of the small community that you live in and the way that you guys preserve your culture. The next thing I want to talk about is Theo's jokes in general. So I talked about this in the video that I did when he interviewed Thomas Massey, and I was saying that I do like his sense of humor, but you have to have a lot of knowledge about different topics and the world in general in order to understand what he's poking fun of when he's making his jokes. And so there are a lot of times where he would say something I wouldn't really laugh because I didn't get it, and there are other times where I so clearly got what he was saying. And so you can really see that in this interview, because obviously Timothy is 16 years old, 16, 17 years old. He's from the Amish community, completely different culture. And so he's not naturally going to know some of the things that Theo Von is talking about. And then they were also saying in the comments that he doesn't really get sarcasm and jokes and all of that stuff. And so Theo would make a joke and he's kind of playing into something, and Timothy would think that he was being serious and would also like continue to play into it, but not quite talking about it in the way that Theo meant. And so you can see that playing out throughout this conversation. But I also thought that it spoke to Theo's comedic skills, that he's able to quickly respond to something and do it in a witty way to where you're like, oh, I didn't think about it that way, and it makes you laugh because he's also correcting what he's saying. And so I just thought that his comedic skills were on point in this interview, and for the most part I understood everything that he was saying, and there were some things where I was like, hey, wait, what do you mean by that? And so it was just a really good interview to see him being able to change the way that he interacts with his guests, but then also kind of retain his comedic skills and the things that he would just naturally say. But he did have to obviously filter himself a little bit throughout this conversation, considering that he was talking to a younger adult or a teenager. Okay, so now moving on, let's get into some funny moments. So I laughed out loud seriously when they were talking about Little House on the Prairie. And let me just play the clip and then we can talk about it.
What about Little House on the Prairie? You guys ever watch that?
I've seen a little bit on that, like,
Couple hotties on there.
yeah, like the ones they almost you mean like Laura?
I mean, that's a child, but I mean, yeah, I don't even know the mom. I'm talking about the mom.
Oh, the mom?
Yeah, Carolyn.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
She's cute.
Yeah, kinda. But isn't she like really old now?
She's getting older probably, but who knows what could happen. They're doing a lot of there's a lot of biohacking and stuff now. But I'm just saying.
Okay, so this was really funny because one, he was trying to connect to Timothy and say, hey, a couple of hotties there. So he's talking about age appropriate people for Timothy, but Timothy kind of throws it back on him and says like, well, who are you talking about? Like, who do you find hot, right? And so that's why it gets awkward because Theo is realizing like, hey, I have to give a really good answer here. And he's just quick with it. And he's like, well, no, that's a child. I'm talking about the mom, right? So he's trying to navigate this really awkward moment because Timothy really didn't understand like what he was saying or how he was trying to like relate to him as a teenager. And so that just made it even more funny. And then they're talking about, oh, well, isn't she really old now? Like, yeah, probably. And then he goes into like bio hacking and things that people can do to prolong their lifespan, right? And so what I found funny though, because before Theo made his remark, well, that's a child, I didn't think there was anything wrong with this conversation because subconsciously I understood that he was saying like, Timothy, do you think any girls who are age appropriate are attractive in this TV show? Like he's trying to relate to him on that level. And obviously I would assume that Timothy meant Laura as an adult. But when I watched it back, I realized that the image that they showed of Little House on the Prairie was when Laura was much older. And I did not know the characters' names at all. So that's why I also missed it in real time. But I thought that the way that Theo Von reacted was what made this funny, because prior to that, I was like, okay, this is normal. He's talking about teenage girls being attractive, basically, in terms of Timothy. And so in watching it back, I saw that Laura in the image that they showed was a child. So obviously they just looked at that image. So he has to respond in this way. And then he says, hey, this is teenager, whatever the older sister's name is. And he's like, would this be like something that you're attracted to? Does this resemble Amish culture and all of that stuff? And so in that lens, it made sense. But what made this moment funny was it was Theo Von's reaction. You had to go like, wait, what just happened? Because I just completely understood it in a different way, but I also understand why Theo Von responded the way that he did, because that was definitely an awkward and slippery moment right there. So yeah, but this was definitely a funny moment. And then they continued to talk about the other characters from Little House on the Prairie. They were talking about the dad at one point, and he was like, oh, he has gray hair. He's probably really old now. He's like, oh no, that guy is deceased. And so that made me laugh as well, because he's having to awkwardly and politely explain these different situations, because Timothy's a kid. Yes, he's a kid, but he's also very different than the average 16-year-old in regular society because of how limited his exposure is. And some of it is kind of common sense, like people age, but at the same time, you're talking about this still moment in history when the show is recorded and when that picture is taken. So you're not really thinking about the passage of time since that photo was taken. And so I can understand why Timothy was like, oh, well, he's pretty old now, right? Like, obviously he knows that people die and stuff like that, but he was just not able to kind of connect the dots and kind of make the connections the way that a normal teenager would. And so I just found that innocent and wholesome, and really good to see that interaction play out on TV, because it really does remind you that children are children. And then the other moment that I found funny was when he was talking about driving the Corvette. So I mentioned that earlier. And this was a car, I guess, an ex-Amish person had. So he was driving the Corvette with two girls in there. And he was talking about how there was only two seats and there wasn't enough room. And then the girl had to sit like in an awkward space. And then he was talking about how the Corvette went really fast. And he compared it to horses who have been given special oats. So he's making this analogy again in terms of what he knows and the experiences that he had. And so it was just really interesting and really wholesome and cool to see someone making these really old-fashioned and old-school analogies, because if you've been in regular society, you know that we haven't ridden horses every day and as our main mode of transportation for like centuries now at this point, right? Maybe not centuries, but at least 100 years, right? So yeah, so it was just really kind of jarring in a sense to see someone make an analogy like that, but also understanding the Amish culture and where they come from and all of that stuff and what they're used to. You can understand why he gave that analogy. I kind of briefly touched on this earlier, and this was the moment where he's talking about the bishop dying because his house caught on fire, and basically because they don't use electricity, Theo is thinking ahead, and he's like, oh, was it a candle? And I was like, oh my God, when he said that, because I understood why he said that. And then Timothy, he reacted to it and responded. It was like, hey, you know, what did a candle? But if he got like why he was making that joke, he probably would have laughed and all of that stuff. And so it was just really funny to see Theo making his like witty comments, and like if you weren't as sharp and keeping up, you would have been like, hey, why did he say that? But if you were keeping up, you understood like what he was getting at, and that just made it more funny. And then I did see comments speaking to this where they were saying kind of towards the end of the interview, Timothy was kind of picking up on like the little jokes that he's making and giving him jokes right back and playing along with it, because at the beginning he was kind of more like innocently like taking him at face value for what he said, and then kind of towards the end he seemed to catch on a little bit and kind of get that Theo was being funny with what he was saying and kind of not truly being serious in what he was saying. And so this was definitely a good interview to watch for so many different reasons. Alrighty, so to wrap up this video, there are a lot of things in this interview that I did not cover because I wanted to keep this video short, but this truly was a great interview to watch, and I'm definitely curious to see what will happen with Timothy. Like, what decision will he make? Will he leave the Amish community or will he stay in the Amish community? And I feel like because he did talk quite a bit about people who left the Amish community and kind of how they were treated by those still in the Amish community, as far as like were they shunned, did their families interact with them, speak to them, that sort of thing. And so I'm wondering what he'll decide and if we will get an update on that, because I kind of really hope that he stays with the Amish community just because of that wholesome and that community factor and all of it just seems like a much more innocent and a much more healthy way to live than the way that we live in regular society. Like, I can see someone, this is I guess the equivalent of a small town kid going to Hollywood, and then they get trapped in that crazy fast-paced lifestyle, and then sometimes they end up dead, other times they end up going back home because they realize, hey, Hollywood is not for me. And so I think this is exactly what I think happens to people who are in the Amish community and they're exploring whether or not they want to leave or stay. And so I hope that he stays, just because the real world, the real society is not all that is cracked up to be, and there are a lot of dangers, especially for someone like him who's saying, you know, hey, I'm getting all of these experiences, I only have an 8th grade education, all of that stuff. And you can see like how easy it is to like manipulate someone who is in that situation where they don't have a whole lot of life experience and they're just so mesmerized by everything new that they are experiencing that it can cloud your decision making. And so I do hope that he stays in the Amish community. However, I hope that he can continue to have like a social media following and all of that stuff, because he did so well in this podcast for it being his first, I guess, public appearance and all of that stuff. And so I can see people wanting to get into that side of things and wanting to kind of like make a name for themselves on social media, because at one point they were talking about how his cousin, who is ex-Amish, she had a TikTok where I guess she was making Amish recipes and all of that stuff. And so I think you can have the best of both worlds. You can be a part of the Amish community but also have a social media presence. Ideally, that is what I would want to see for him. And I'm wondering how ex-Amish people feel about this interview, because I did see a comment where someone was saying, no, hey, I grew up Amish, I'm ex-Amish, and this was a good interview. But I'm wondering what people who have left the community, what they've experienced in the real world compared to how they grew up. Because right now, I guess I'm kind of glorifying Amish culture as far as like, hey, you know, it's so wholesome, it's so much better than regular society. And there can be downfalls of being in the Amish community. I totally get that. But I'm also wondering what people who have left the community actually feel and think when they've been removed from the Amish community for like 5-10 years or something like that, to where they have enough exposure and day-to-day experience in the real world to where it's not just like a fun phase, if that makes sense. And so I would be really curious to learn more about that. Alrighty, so yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this interview. Let me know what your thoughts are on Theo Von, on Timothy, on Amish culture. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.